Okay, we may have a few more people join us, but let's go ahead and get started. First of all, let me say good morning or good afternoon to each of you, depending on where you're joining us from. We're happy to welcome you to today's presentation of results from the final performance evaluation of the Apolou Resilience Food Security Activity implemented by Mercy Corps in 5 eastern districts of Karamoja, Uganda. My name is Tom Spangler, and I work with Save the Children as Activity Director for the Impel Associate Award. And I'll ask Terry to paste a link in the chat box to a brief that provides a bit more detailed information on Impel's activities. Most of you will already know that the overall purpose of Impel is to conduct both performance and impact evaluations and facilitate knowledge sharing to improve design and implementation of BHA-funded resilience food security activities. Today's presentation will be led by Tango International. Tango is among the first of Impel's 5 research partners and has extensive experience in designing and conducting rigorous research on food and livelihood security programming throughout sub-Saharan Africa, including previous research for BHA. I'll pass it to Jean Downen, Vice President of Tango, who will be leading the presentation today. She'll be giving an overview of the Apolou program and evaluation design, including the methods used, as well as results from the end-line evaluation. Tango will also be responding to questions you might have about the findings, but in the interest of time, we ask that they be given a chance to do that after they've completed the presentation. So if questions occur to you during the presentation, we just ask that you use the Q&A function. You'll find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enter your question so that we can save those for the end and get through as many as possible. Finally, today's presentation and Q&A will be recorded, but that recording will only be used for Impel and BHA to refer back to, and it won't be shared publicly. So with that, I'll thank each of you again for joining us today, and I'll pass it off to Jean to get us started.
Jean. All right, thank you, Tom. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. As Tom has mentioned, this is the final performance evaluation of the Apolou BHA Resilience Food Security Activity in Uganda. Briefly, the agenda for today's presentation will provide background and overview, the evaluation's objectives and approach, findings, unintended consequences, lessons learned and good practices, and as Tom noted, you will have a chance to post your questions, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. We have a lot of findings to present today. So in the interest of time and keeping within our 1-hour limit and allowing time for Q&A, I'll go through the background to the project and the evaluation quickly. I think most people are already familiar with it, so as to allow more time to present the findings. This was a mixed methods performance evaluation funded by Impel and conducted by Tango International in conjunction with our local partner in Uganda, the International Research Consortium of Uganda. The baseline was conducted in 2018. The end-line data was collected in mid-2023, and the project closed out in September of 2023. A brief overview of the activity of Apolou. It was implemented by Mercy Corps and its partners. It ran for 6 years with a 1-year extension from 2017 to 2023. And as Tom mentioned, Apolou worked in 5 eastern districts of Karamoja. It had 4 overall purposes. The first was inclusive and effective governance, contributing to food and nutrition security. The second was ensuring that adolescent girls, pregnant and lactating women, and children under 5 are nutritionally secure. The third was to reduce incidences of WASH-related diseases. The fourth was to improve livelihoods and income support for household food security. And there were several cross-cutting themes related to social behavior change, resilience, adolescent inclusion, and gender mainstreaming. The evaluation objectives, which Tom touched on briefly, was to look at RFSA performance, to assess the performance of activity management systems and processes, evaluate the effectiveness of the technical interventions, and identify unintended consequences, lessons learned, and best practices. It was a mixed methods approach. It was not an impact evaluation, as there was no counterfactual. So that does not allow statements about attribution or causation relating to program impact. It was a population-based survey with questions added to identify the RFSA participants. There was a household survey in July of 2023, a qualitative exercise in August of 2023. And the quantitative analysis looked at comparisons baseline versus end line for all for the population, and then direct participants versus non-participants using descriptive and multivariate analysis. For the qualitative analysis, we used a thematic analysis of patterns and outliers, and applied triangulation and contextualization to see what the qualitative data, what it showed, and what the perceptions and opinions of the participants were. On to findings. First of all, an overview of activity participation. There were interventions in 3 major categories: community groups, trainings, and services. There were a number of community groups, both existing and formed by Apolou, including savings and loans groups, mother care groups, resilience action committees, peace committees, male change agents, and training centered around nutrition, the mother care groups training, peace advocacy, livestock management, agricultural improvement, gender equity, advocacy, and government accountability. So a wide range of activities and services. And then in the direct services, nutrition vouchers and agricultural seedlings. Approximately 38% of the surveyed households participated in more than one intervention, with an average of 4.9 interventions per household out of a possible 59. The average participation by category of intervention, there was 2.1 groups out of 14, 1.7 trainings out of 34, and 1 service out of 11. You'll see briefly from this graph, and I know it's a lot to absorb in a few minutes, but people will have a chance to look at this more closely afterwards, that the Apollo groups, if you look on the left, the Apollo groups with the highest participation were the mother care groups, the savings and loan groups, and the peace committees. And on the right, the Apollo services and trainings with the highest participation were agricultural seedlings, the food vouchers, improved nutrition training, and promoter roles such as the mother care groups and the silk groups. For targeting, Apollo worked via existing local structures, and through the structures it encouraged and created. And that was considered effective for identifying vulnerable groups because it had the input of the community members. For instance, the Resilience Action Committee members, the farmer enterprise groups, the mother care groups, and local leaders were all involved. And local councils were involved in identifying the WASH beneficiaries. According to the qualitative interviews, the targeting approach was widely regarded as reaching the entire community and not leaving anyone out or discriminating against anyone. Key informants noted that any service that the Resilience Action Committees advocated for ultimately benefited everyone without discrimination. And The water and sanitation and hygiene activities were also reviewed as serving everyone equally. On to key findings by project goal. The overall project goal was food and nutrition security. So looking at the household dietary diversity score, which is the number of food groups consumed out of 12 of the last 24 hours, that there was no overall change between baseline and end line. Households consume an average of 3.7 food groups, but the dietary diversity score was higher for RFSA participants than non-RFSA participants, 3.9 versus 3.5. And according to the multivariate analysis, participation in the savings and loan groups and the mother care groups was associated with higher dietary diversity score at the household level. While there's improvement, the overall dietary diversity score is still low. Some of the insights from the qualitative survey: there was high food insecurity during much of the project life at the start and later on in the project due to prolonged drought and some other factors. But the interventions were viewed by participants as improving food security. There was a distribution of food rations during the drought. There was training on good farming practices and availability of improved seeds, and training on permagardens and kitchen gardens, which helped improve household food availability and quality. Purpose 1, which addressed governance. Some of the key findings were: the survey results indicated a moderate rating of government's responsiveness to citizens' needs, a score of 5 on a scale of 10. Qualitative findings across the board painted a positive picture of governance results and the results of the resilience action committees. People spoke of improvements in government effectiveness, transparency, attributed to stronger links with existing structures at local and county and district level, and the fact that the resilience action committees were able to prioritize community issues, present them to duty bearers at community meetings and in other forum, and hold the duty bearers, the government service providers, accountable. The governance training was also perceived to have enhanced government responsiveness to community needs. We had one quote from a government planner in Kabong district to the effect that government representatives didn't have to do as much explaining now when they go to the community, because people have a greater understanding of what services the government is supposed to offer and can offer, and they're able to articulate their needs unlike before. And the quote is: somehow these structures have helped to enlighten communities, the way they present their issues, think, and act on matters. So the sustainability of outcomes is evident and reinforced by the qualitative interviews in governance and food security. Apollou's capacity strengthening has benefited local community services organizations like NAROA and CAPTA, which have been able to build on their training to foster stronger linkages with local government and communities, and also secure funding from other sources. And the resilience action committees, which are composed of a diverse number of community members, gained community recognition, and now they're integrated into local governance systems, where some of the local governments consult with the RAC committees. On to purpose 2, health and nutrition. Some of the key findings are: In women's health and nutrition, the prevalence of underweight among women of reproductive age declined from between baseline and end line from 31% to 47.2%. And there was no difference between RFSA and non-RFSA participants. The multivariate analysis found that women who participated in the savings and loan groups are less likely to be underweight. In terms of the minimum dietary diversity for women, there were about 15% of women who achieved that, but again, no difference between baseline and end-line foundings. There was a broad-based decline in dietary diversity, driven by reduced consumption of vegetables, dairies, and fruits. And this was a direct result of drought and some of the other shocks that affected the region throughout the project period. Consumption of legumes and beans did increase from between baseline and end line from 22.4% to 36.2% of households. For contraceptive use, it increased only among women in RFSA households, from all households at 13.1% at baseline to 23% at end line. There are a number of traditional beliefs on contraceptive methods that presented a challenge, and which women said they preferred to use over more modern methods of contraception. Antenatal care visits increased by almost 10 percentage points, reflecting improved health awareness and accessibility. And there were increases for both men and women with children under 2, making decisions about maternal health jointly, and in making decisions about child health jointly. For instance, the decisions about child health increased from a baseline of 41% among women to an end line of 64.7% among women, and among men, a substantial increase in joint decision-making about children's health from a baseline of 47.1% to an end line of 72.6%. These increases in antenatal care visits and joint decision-making on health were driven by the RFSA households. And it aligns with what people said in the qualitative survey, that men's attitudes are shifting towards supporting women in ensuring adequate food, antenatal care, and the importance of delivering babies in a health facility. For child anthropometric indicators, all worsened over the period of time: stunting, underweight, and wasting. And you can see from the data on the screen, there was a change of 10 percentage points or more, and all of these findings are statistically significant. There were no differences between RFSA and non-RFSA households, except that stunting was lower, that is better, among RFSA households than non-RFSA households. And this is attributed to the severe and protracted shock context. Even though these results have worsened, it is likely that the Apolou activities helped prevent further deterioration, and the findings would have been worse without the project interventions. For infant and young child feeding practices, exclusive breastfeeding was fairly high, but no change between baseline and end line. For the minimum acceptable diet, again, no change between baseline and end line. And just a note that the minimum acceptable diet is a composite indicator that combines a number of key variables to look at child nutrition. There was a decrease in the percent of children consuming targeted nutrient-rich foods, quite steep one from baseline of 14.1% to an end line of 4.7%. However, children in RFSA households fared better in that there were 8.6% of children in RFSA households consuming nutrient-rich foods compared to non-RFSA households, which was less than 2%. And again, malnutrition was exacerbated by environmental and economic factors. There was a study by Horacio and Ayele in 2022, which is part of the Karamoja resilience activity, that stated that limited progress on child nutrition does not indicate a lack of knowledge, but rather a lack of resources for caregivers. And this is something that the evaluation found was consistent with these findings. People know what good practices are, but they often don't have the resources to put them into practice. On sustainability of outcomes for health and nutrition, there was high motivation, as voiced by the qualitative respondents, to continue Apolou promoted health services because people said they see improvements in nutrition, in breastfeeding, and antenatal care. There's greater male support and involvement, as noted, and the male change agents are still motivated to do their work because they have seen the change. Apolou's approach planned for sustainability by revitalizing and strengthening existing structures like the mother care groups and working with government-supported structures, in this case, village health teams. And you'll see in the lower box a statement that the Ministry of Health has adopted the mother care group model into their system and will continue this beyond the project. So that is a certainly a good indicator of sustainability of the mother care group approach. On to WASH key findings for purpose 3. There was an increase in diarrhea prevalence among children under 5. Significantly worse in poor households, increasing by about 9 percentage points for poor households. However, qualitative respondents perceived an improvement in particularly a reduction of diarrhea in children, and they attributed this to improved wash facilities, to greater knowledge about hygiene and household cleanliness, to reduced open defecation and greater use of latrines. The quantitative survey showed there's still limited access to basic sanitation facilities, less than 10% of households, and hand washing stations with soap and water. Again, people established hand washing stations, but they found they were often destroyed or the jerry cans were stolen at night. But on the practices side, the clean household approach introduced by Apolou triggered communities to practice better sanitation across the board with things that they could control more: hand washing, drying racks, latrines, and rubbish pits. And you'll see there's one quote there from a mother care group in Moroto district that before Apolou, general hygiene was poor in most homes, but with Apolou training, there was a significant improvement and awareness of the importance of cleanliness in the homes. For drinking water, access to drinking water remained the same, around 40% of households, with no baseline end line change. Although there was an improvement in the time required to collect drinking water in less than 30 minutes, particularly among poor households, there was a significant reduction in the amount of time required to collect water from 43.9% at baseline to 64% at end line. The qualitative interviews showed a perceived increase in access due to borehole construction and support from the water user committees that were formed under Apolou. And the most common drinking water source was from a tube well or borehole, which was also constructed by the project. In terms of the sustainability of WASH outcomes, community said they're motivated to continue practices because they've been sensitized to and see the health benefits of better hygiene practices, better water availability, specifically less dysentery, less diarrhea in children under 2. And people have gained a positive outlook on personal hygiene, clean homes and compounds, and other hygienic practices. In terms of district and sub-county water supply boards, the water user committees are in place. They're managing boreholes and water issues. They've been largely successful, and communities are now accustomed not only to access clean water, but they're motivated to pay user fees, and the fees are constructed in a way that they're affordable to households and shared among households. There's some challenges, as some people only want to pay when there's a breakdown. And the water user committees and the household fee structure also faces another challenge in terms of contributing to borehole operation, in that office seekers often repair boreholes during election campaigns and tell voters that water provision is a government responsibility. So that contributes to some reluctance among some households to pay. Also, another point on the water user committees is that equal representation of women is important, as women are responsible for household health and sanitation in Karamoja. And sub-county chiefs who were interviewed during the qualitative are informed about the achievement in the areas of jurisdiction, which of course helps them accomplish their goals. And so they said they're motivated to sustain support to these activities and groups. A few more outcomes. Latrine promotion will continue, as it's the responsibility of sub-county and local councils, but of course they're constrained by resources. There are continuing challenges to continued use of latrines, which I think many people are familiar with. Weak soils that don't support the structures. The latrines collapse during the rainy season. Termites destroy the wooden support structures. And people said that the concrete slabs are not affordable and hard to transport. So an overall low demand and low use of latrines. Moving on to purpose 4, economic indicators, livelihoods, and resilience. There are continue to be high rates of poverty in the implementation area in Karamoja. So there was no baseline to end line change in the average prevalence of poverty. Over 85% of households are poor, and the average daily capital expenditures remain around the equivalent of $1 US. There was improvement in the depth of poverty, meaning people are less poor, but they still do not reach the poverty line of US dollars 190 per day. And you'll see there the baseline 62.5%, and that improved to 55% at end line. On livelihoods, there was an increase in the average number of livelihoods in the project area from 3 livelihoods to 4.3, and greater livelihood diversification for participants. The top livelihoods that were practiced by people, and this is for all groups in the area, not just the RFSA participants, were crop production, which you see increased from 58.8% to 79.3%. Agricultural wage labor, non-agricultural wage labor, and the qualitative findings showed that RFSA households engaged in these practices at a higher rate than non-RFSA households. Common businesses were charcoal making, brewing, and brick making, and there was increased engagement in cash earning opportunities. You'll see a significant increase from baseline to an end line of 77.4%. There was also increased use of safety net food and cash assistance, particularly during the drought, and it was significantly higher for RFSA participants than non-RFSA participants. Even though there's been, it's important to note here in terms of the livelihoods that the income generated from these livelihoods was not enough to decrease the overall poverty, which is why the poverty rates have not improved significantly. And this was due to household losses from shocks, including drought, crop disease, pests, theft, global food price increases. So even though there's been progress on outcome indicators, progress doesn't necessarily translate into improvements in impact indicators because of the shocks. So people may be diversifying their livelihoods because of crop and economic shocks in order to maintain their food security and expenditures. But circumstances prevent many households from significant improvements in their poverty levels, in their food security levels, because of changes in the larger environment. In terms of crop production, Apolou introduced a new agriculture, water and soil conservation practices, which people said improved production and quality. There were collective sales, which improved bargaining and obtained better prices. People were able to implement better animal care practices and were connected with private area service providers, private sector providers, through the farmer enterprise group, the livestock enterprise groups, to obtain inputs that they needed to put their training into practice, along with skills in financial management, businesses, and participation in silks. In terms of livestock production, there wasn't any change in engagement in livestock production as a livelihood. It remained between 26 and 29%. And this may be a reflection of the sharp increase in recent years in livestock theft. Engagement was higher for RFSA participants, significantly so. At the end line, 40.2% of RFSA households engaged in livestock production, with a much lower percentage of households in non-RFSA areas participating. And this reflects the success of Apolou veterinary extension services and training on animal fattening, access to vaccines, dewormers, tick spray, and similar activities, along with the work of the livestock enterprise groups that worked with these private service providers and the community animal health workers to promote greater livestock production. The participation in value chain activities for around 28% of households were consistent with higher engagement among RFSA participants and increases in specific value chain practices such as the procurement of crop inputs and drying and processing of produce. The value chain practices were higher at end line for RFSA participants in sorting, drying and processing, and livestock input procurement. For financial services, the use of group-based financial services doubled between baseline and end line to achieved 43% of households at N-line, and this includes both formal and informal group-based savings, microfinancing, silks, etc. There was a much higher usage and participation for RFSA participants, 55.2% versus non-RFSA participants at 35.4%. And these supportings were supported by strong qualitative input. People talked about the widespread adoption and importance and success of silks to their households and to their enterprises. And project staff in Apolou noted that layering silks with other activities led to increased income because it gave people the resources to put into practice what they had been trained on. For sustainability of outcomes, silks are expected to be sustained. For instance, with the farmer enterprise groups, they provide funds to purchase quality agricultural inputs. And private seed suppliers are motivated to continue working with farmers as their sales have been steady and they're able to sell other inputs. And participants are motivated to continue purchasing hybrid seeds from the private sector because of high yields. As noted, prolonged drought and disease have harmed crops and poultry, and a major factor in Karamoja was the insecurity and the cattle raiding, which have prevented livestock herders from fully implementing their training, because as they produced healthier livestock, these livestock were targeted for theft, and collective marketing stalled because once cows were gathered in one area, they were subject to theft on a large scale. And these were substantial challenges that people talked about. Key findings: first of all, unintended consequences. The high insecurity context, which was not present so much during the beginning of the RFSA, but certainly increased during the RFSA period, and had an effect on a wide range of activities. People in the qualitative survey talked about fear of insecurity prevented farmers, particularly women, from going to their fields, prevented mothers from going to health facilities in the evening, and, as mentioned, improving livestock health made the animals more vulnerable to theft. The peace committees faced risks. One of their roles was to inform the army of stolen animals and raiders, so this led to a perception by the cattle thieves that peace committees were actually government informers, which raised the risk to members of the peace committees. And in 2021, Apolou discontinued the peace committee interventions when an NGO staff was injured and a sub-county official killed in an attack by raiders. Peace committees do continue to work to sensitize people against conflict and to mediate domestic and community conflicts, and have been effective in that regard, despite the risk to themselves. In latrine construction, as mentioned, there were a lot of challenges to latrine construction. One thing that was mentioned is thieves hid in shallow latrine pits at night before they attacked homes. And this came from focus groups and key informants in several districts. And then community members were exposed to risk when going out to gather poles and grass and other things to build the latrine superstructure. So an unintended consequence of this was the building of latrines, along with other activities, introduced some unintended security risks in some communities due to the larger environment. Lessons learned and good practices. Some of the lessons learned was to build on community-based initiatives and structures to foster change. And one of the key elements of Apollou's success was the creation and strengthening of locally led structures grounded in the community. These structures included active community members, elders, existing groups, and as mentioned, there were a number of groups: the mother care groups, male change agents, the savings and loan groups, natural resource management, safety net, disaster risk reduction committees, and the resilience action committees, among others. There were also farmer enterprise groups, livestock enterprise groups. The resilience action committees were important for strengthening links with local government and holding local authorities accountable and giving communities a voice in government decisions. Apolou emphasized capacity strengthening, collaboration with government, accountability, and peer-to-peer modeling in areas, for instance, health and sanitation practices, often led by the mother care group leaders or members of the mother care group. Another lesson focused on sensitization and behavior change, that consistent messages across a variety of groups are important to support behavior change. So not just through one group, but through all groups, talking about health and sanitation, gender equity, a number of practices. So continual reinforcement across the sources and the groups that were participating in Apollo. And again, the realization that knowledge alone is not enough. Shocks and poverty are barriers to adoption, as I'm sure all of our audience members know, and people may need more material support in some instances, because knowledge is not sufficient when people don't have the resources. And once again, the engagement of community members as promoters of change through Apollo help ensure sustainability. People in the qualitative survey said that they have experienced the benefits of behavior change that they themselves help bring about, so that they will continue to practice these improved behaviors in health and sanitation and other areas. There are greater connections with government, and people are better able to voice their needs to government. But one challenge to these community-based initiatives remains that while government officials are open to community requests, they suffer themselves from budget limitations that constrain them from being able to satisfy these community needs. Another lesson learned and good practice, which people are already familiar with, is to emphasize gender equality across all activities, not just through certain activities. So in this case, a few examples are the resilience action committees. Women gained confidence from training and participation in broader forum, as well as community meetings and interaction with government, and came to be respected by government officials for their work. For IGAs, allowed some women to buy land for the first time and acquire other assets. The male change agents sensitized men to their wives' needs and opinions. And the mother care groups and other health providers were also instrumental in persuading men to take more interest in their wives and their children's health and to support them better. In terms of layering and sequencing interventions, the combination of project interventions provided resources to help put knowledge into action. And this was an important aspect of the project. Again, one example, membership in a savings and loan group, plus the perma gardens or kitchen gardens practiced by mother care groups and some resilience action committee members, plus their training in improved agricultural practices, provided project participants the additional income along with the knowledge to improve their household food security, and in some instances have additional produce to sell, which would provide them with an income. So Apollou's approach of layering and sequencing activities to strengthen the ability of participants to implement those activities and put behavior change messages into effect was an important aspect of the program. And it's especially evident with the SILCs, the savings and loan groups, which enabled groups to access cash to invest in new businesses or meet household needs and have emergency funds. More lessons learned and good practices: building contingencies to address severe shocks, stresses, and insecurity. A drought and conflict are recurring and persistent problems in Karamoja that long predate the project. From inception, incorporate training and activities in disaster risk reduction and mitigation and conflict sensitization and mitigation. And in this instance, in Karamoja, focus on greater inclusion of male youth. Male youth were often idle. They had no employment, no income generating activities, nothing to occupy them. So they were often recruited for cattle theft. And this, in Karamoja region, the cattle theft in recent years has been organized on a large scale. It's not the traditional raiding practiced by different groups, but this was commercialized so that there were well-funded groups, thought to be businesses, and other groups who were paying youth and others to implement large-scale cattle theft. So it wasn't just a few cattle. Sometimes farmers would have, or livestock producers would have their entire herd stolen. And this affected a large proportion of the livestock owners. So male youth are interested in income generating activities, particularly ones that have an immediate benefit, and they're less motivated to participate in activities that don't have an immediate benefit, that maybe take longer to produce a return. And other activities are important for individual and social development. So the male youth need to be targeted not just for income generating activities, but included in the other behavior change and training activities in gender equality, conflict mitigation, health and nutrition, and so forth. So that is the presentation. I apologize for the rapid pace, but I will turn it back over to Tom for the next steps. Tom, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jean. Those findings were definitely informative and very clearly presented. So thanks for that. There have been relatively few questions, and the ones that are still outstanding kind of are on a similar thread. I'll use one that's posed by Arif Rashid. Said, you've noted that activities are likely to be sustained. And he points out that the activity developed or strengthened local service providers, and that they're intended to be providing services in the final year of the activity. So his question is, did you ask communities about them or interview local service providers to better understand how they're doing and whether people are accessing those services and paying for those services? And Taka just has a similar question, just on the question of sustainability, wondering if you looked in particular about, say, the 4 identified factors that are commonly referenced in terms of sustainability. Those are resources, capacity, motivation, and linkages. Let me stop there.
Okay, that was
It's all about sustainability, whether you looked
Yeah.
into sustainability and what you found there.
The sustainability findings came not surprisingly, from the qualitative input, which I will note was consistent across groups and key informants. And people were very enthusiastic about the positive changes they'd seen because they were able to observe improvements in a number of areas. And I'm looking at one question about measuring sustainability on the basis of resources, capacity, motivation, and linkages. All of these were considered in the sustainability analysis and were covered through lengthy interviews with qualitative respondents. So, for instance, in terms of capacity, people talked about what they had learned, how behavior had changed. I've already covered motivation, linkages with local government in particular, and resources, which, as you know, vary quite substantially among both for government and participants, which do have a direct effect on sustainability of things like boreholes and meeting community requests. And Tom, could you repeat Arif's question? I did not get all of that. And
Yeah, this question, I think you covered much of it, and it was really centered on local service providers. And he was wondering whether you interviewed any of the local service providers to understand how and if they're still functioning, and whether community members are paying those service providers for the services.
at the time of the qualitative survey, we did interview both a number of service providers across all five districts and community members. Most of the, for instance, the water user committees were functioning and being sustained. There was interest and even enthusiasm on the part of government service providers to continue, although they did acknowledge resource constraints. And one of the most significant changes, I think, was the adoption of the mother care group model by the district government, and also the linkages of the resilience action committees, an incorporation of community requests and plans through the resilience action committee members into parish development plans. So there has been a more formal integration of some of these project activities with local government initiatives. Back to you, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Jean. I see that someone's got their hand raised with a question, and I encourage others to raise their hand, and you can come off mute and pose the question yourself. Before I call on that one, I know that there's been a question posed earlier by Shawnee Hoover at BHA. And Shawnee asks, did male youth activities go beyond training and link up with private sector? Say, for instance, directly linking of improved labor supply with direct labor demand.
Well, I'll answer from the qualitative point of view, and some of our other Tango team may want to add to that. Male youth were part of livestock intergroups and farmer enterprise groups, and but were not specifically targeted as a separate interest group on their own. And Apollou's training centered around income generation. And I do not believe they looked at local labor markets and local labor demand beyond what what individual or group income generating activities were uh, most feasible in those areas. Over.
Okay, thank you, Jean. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but I'll say Jafidra. If you could come off mute and pose your question, that would be great.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
We can, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Mine is not a question, mine is just like more like a comment. I kept hearing cattle theft. I think in a Karamoja context, that's somehow misleading because cattle theft is normally, and the understanding is it's done in an organized way. It's like you come, you don't do harm, you just do a week, steal the animal. But in the context of Apollo, cattle theft, it wasn't theft per se, it's raid. Raid means you do a lot of havoc, rape, killing, and a lot of destruction. I think it's forceful. It's not like stealing. It's really hard-handedness. I don't know if we could change that language, customize it in a way that it makes a big sense that it's really something which is forceful done. Thank you and over.
Tom, I could not hear a lot of that. Could you summarize it, please?
I can try to summarize, and Jafidra, please weigh in. I think it wasn't so much a question, he was just clarifying when we use the term theft of livestock. I think the point was made that it's somewhat different and broader than that, and the intent is really to just be as disruptive as possible. So while it does include theft, often it's of large numbers, as you pointed out, but these raids also just cause as much havoc and create a lot of destruction and damage in addition to the actual loss of or theft of livestock assets.
Yeah, yeah. That's a very good point. And I see in the chat a comment from BHA that says enthusiasm without concrete action does not result in sustainability. But I think I'd like to emphasize that the point there is that people were enthusiastic about continuing behavior changes because they had seen the positive results in things like hygiene and sanitation and even bringing up issues to local government and encouraging accountability. And everyone acknowledges there are resource constraints which are going to affect actions and sustainability. But I think it's important to recognize that the many of the behavior change initiatives were adopted by people, and they stated in the qualitative survey their intention to continue because they had seen the positive changes as a result. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean. We've got a request to circle back on one question. Now, I know that we are at time, so for those who are willing and able to stay, Jean, if you could provide a response to this. For those who are not able to stay, we'll provide written response. But it's circling back, it's from Chung, really circling back on a question from Killian, and that was, what was the level of coverage or intensity at the village level or the lowest administrative level? And did that vary significantly by type of intervention? And what differences did we notice in terms of outcomes based on the intensity or coverage per administrative area?
Okay. I'm looking at your question, Killian. It's quite comprehensive. I'm going to address the last point first, where you asked, were the interventions designed as packages or singular interventions? And that that a participant selected. People were free to join whatever groups that they were interested in, and there were some people who were members of multiple groups, which I think you find in any community anywhere. And here is where some of this layering activity came in. There are people who were members of silk groups, or perhaps people who joined one group, like a farmer enterprise group, who were then encouraged to join or form a silk group. So it's more the aspect was more layering activities, so particularly silk activities, so people would have the income to implement practices rather than a package of interventions. In terms of the level of coverage or intensity, at the village level, we did have some information on the number of activities, the average number of activities that people participated in. And I don't have that data right in front of me. Maybe one of our quantitative team can bring that up. But in terms of the differences in outcomes based on the intensity of coverage per administrative area, I don't think we analyzed it at that level. We looked at the entire N-line, baseline versus N-line area, and then at RFSA and non-RFSA participants. So I don't think we have the data to answer that one.
Sorry if this is Mark Langworthy. If I could just jump in quickly and say, I put in the response to Killian. One thing that we did do, which is a way to try and address the question about looking at participation and outcomes. We didn't look at variation across like smaller administrative units, but we did do the multiple regression analysis, which is basically an analysis to try and look at how does participation in different activities and different combination of activities influence outcomes at the level of individual households, while controlling for other kinds of factors, including geographic factors. So we did try and address those questions through the multiple regression analysis. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Thanks, Jean, for your responses to those questions. I know that some have already dropped off. We will circulate responses to the few questions we had to this presentation. I want to thank everyone for joining today, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks for staying with us a few extra minutes. Bye, y'all.